Do you ever think about the people you pass by every day? The people you see on your way to work, the strangers sitting next to you at the movies. With our busy lives, we see and interact with a lot of people. Who are they? Are you inquisitive like I am and wonder who they are and what their life is like? It's said that we pass by 36 murderers in our lifetime. Of course, that's an estimate with so many variables. When I was 17, this thought never crept into my mind. I was working one of my first jobs in ice cream. Never could I have imagined that my job at a Dairy Queen would lead to crossing paths with a serial killer. This is the case of the Tourniquet Killer. I'm Amy, and this is the Crime Queen. We all have memories of our first jobs when we were teenagers. My first few jobs were in food service, as many of you can probably relate to. Teenagers don't usually take these jobs too seriously. Why would they? When I was 17, I started working at the Dairy Queen in late spring of 1992. It was ideal, located right next to the apartments where I lived, and who doesn't like ice cream? I pictured happy people with smiles on their faces as I handed them their sweet treats with sprinkles. The manager was from up north, like I was, Wisconsin, I think. She was happy to add me to her team, telling me she knew I would be a good worker because I'm from the Midwest. The early 90s didn't have cell phones or the internet. If you wanted to know what was going on, you read the newspaper or watched local news. Teenagers don't usually read papers or tune into news broadcasts. I had no idea that the busy little ice cream shop I just began working at had been in all the news shortly before I started. Nobody brought it up, and of course, I didn't know to ask. One afternoon, I was at the counter helping a customer while my manager stood next to me, training. I really wish I could remember what the man looked like, but I can't. He turned to the manager, and I guess I looked new, and he asked, "Weren't you the ones who had all the excitement a few weeks back?" She said, "Yeah, that was us." The man then asked, "Do they know who did it?" "I haven't heard," she responded. Now, my head was going back and forth like I was watching a tennis match. I took the man's order, and we walked over to the kitchen to give them the ticket. Pre-internet, remember. I asked her what he was referring to. "There was a girl found dead out back. The bread guy found her when he showed up for his delivery. She was in the drive-thru lane." My drive-thru lane. My head was spinning. I had so many questions, but nothing came out. She must have realized by the look on my face that I needed more info. She followed with, "We had a few people go through the drive-thru that morning. They called in later." My mouth finally able to form words. I asked, "You mean they drove by her and didn't stop and say anything?" This seemed unbelievable. "They actually had to go around her," she replied. It went from unbelievable to suddenly worse. "Why didn't they stop and tell someone?" I asked. "People don't like to get involved sometimes." She shrugged and walked away. I needed more information. I found out the girl was 20-year-old Maria del Carmen Estrada, known to everybody as Carmen. She was a recent immigrant and was working as a nanny. In the early morning hours of April 16th, 1992, at around 6:30, it was raining as she was walking to her job. A man pulled over and offered her a ride, which she accepted. At 10:30, a bread man making his usual delivery to the Dairy Queen on Westview saw something in his path as he backed the truck to the rear door. He got out of his truck, went around to check out what he had seen in his mirror. There, In front of him was the partially nude, lifeless body of a young woman. The shock of this sight took a few seconds to register. When he realized what he was seeing, he called the manager. They rushed inside to call law enforcement. When police arrived, they went around to the rear of the store where they found Carmen's body lying face down. Upon turning her over, they saw a cord with a bamboo handle wrapped tightly around her neck. There were signs of trauma on her face. Her pants were removed and her underpants and pantyhose were pulled down. Her bra had been cut and her pantyhose were cut in the crotch area. During the autopsy examination, it was determined she had been sexually assaulted. A bloody contusion was found deep inside her vagina, and semen was found in her mouth. The police were certain this was left by the killer, but it was 92. DNA wasn't a thing yet. They also took clippings from her fingernails. It was obvious she had fought her attacker, and police hoped that there would be tissue found under her nails. These clippings would be the key to solving her murder 11 years later. Police were at a loss. They interviewed everyone they could, but they had no real leads. The sheer brutality of the attack on Carmen had them worried that this was someone who had done this before. They also feared he would probably do it again unless he was caught. They were right. On August 7th, 1994, 9-year-old Diana Rebelar was asked by her mother to go get a bag of sugar from the store. Little Diana walked the 3 blocks to the store. Employees remembered seeing her and selling her the sugar. Her mother waited, but Diana never returned home. Her family looked around the neighborhood and didn't find any sign of the little girl. Her mother made a frantic call to police, who responded right away. Police searched the area and questioned anyone who may have seen Diana. A neighbor reported that he had seen a van in the neighborhood. With just a basic description of the van, police really didn't have anything to go on. They continued the search into the night without any luck. Tragically, the little girl's body was found the next day. On a loading dock behind a building, her killer had dumped her. It was a brutal scene. Seasoned detectives were disturbed and haunted by what had happened to this poor little girl. She was nearly nude, only wearing a Halloween t-shirt that had been pushed up around her armpits. She was found with her hands and feet duct taped. She had been badly beaten. Her vagina and anus were bloody. The girl had been strangled with a rope and a bamboo stick, used like a tourniquet. One of the detectives immediately recognized the rope and bamboo. He had seen it before. He believed that little Diana had been murdered by the same monster who had killed Carmen at the Dairy Queen. The killer had struck again, and this time it was a child. They needed to find this predator. The next summer, on July 13th, 1995, a woman working at a local news station received a call on the station's news tip line. This was a phone line they kept open to take any calls from people around the city who had newsworthy stories. The caller started by saying he had a tip. She asked, "Okay, what's the tip?" He said, "There's a serial killer on the loose." The woman wasn't immediately concerned. She often received prank calls on this tip line. He then proceeded to tell her the exact location of a body. He gave her a name and then a birth date for the victim. He described in detail how the body was positioned. He told her the victim's nickname. Then he described the victim's jewelry. It soon dawned on the woman she was being given clues. Clues to a mystery she didn't know anything about yet. The woman became alarmed and started to reach for a key map. The caller told her, "Don't reach for your key map." Chills ran over her body as she realized the man she was on the phone with was watching her. She positioned herself behind a support beam in the office, knowing he could see her through the glass windows. While she wasn't convinced the call was legit when she took it, she now knew she was on the phone with a killer. Her blood ran cold as he continued with the details. As soon as the call ended, she immediately notified Harris County to go search for the body. When officers arrived at the location given by the caller, they didn't need the detailed instructions to know where to look. The smell in the air told them what they feared was true. It was a distinct smell that once you'd experienced it, you'd never forget it. There was a human body nearby. The detectives followed the odor. They found the badly decomposed body of what appeared to be a young woman. The body was positioned just as the caller had described and just where he said it would be. Officers could tell she had been strangled to death. A rope was wound tightly around her neck. A toothbrush was placed in the rope, used as a tourniquet. It was the body of 16-year-old Dana Sanchez, who had been missing for over a week. An autopsy was performed, although not much could be determined due to the condition of the body. They could rule the cause of death as strangulation. Detectives believed the person who killed Dana Sanchez was the same person who murdered Carmen Estrada and little Diana Revelar. It was a unique method of strangulation. The murders were just too similar not to be committed by the same person. But without any physical evidence to tie them together, and without a suspect to compare what they did have to, police were worried they would be investigating yet another victim in the future. They knew time was not on their side. They needed a break in the case to find this monster. They needed to find something to identify this man, something they could use to tie these cases together and match the suspect to his horrific crimes. They would be waiting for that match for another 8 years. In the year 2000, with advances in DNA, detectives were resubmitting evidence from cold cases. The Dairy Queen murder had weighed heavily on detectives' minds. Taking a gamble on technology, they sent the clippings of Carmen Estrada's fingernails to a lab for evaluation. This generated a full DNA profile. This was a huge victory. They now had a complete profile for comparison to a database of known offenders. Hoping that a match would be found, detectives were disappointed when they didn't receive a hit on the profile. It seemed the killer was not a known offender in their database. Or was he? It would take an unbelievable turn of events that would eventually lead to a match for her killer. In 1998, a Houston man was convicted of molesting his 2 daughters. Without any prior arrests on his record, the judge gave him a very lenient sentence. He was given 8 years of probation, a $500 fine, and he was ordered to submit his DNA to an offender database. He also had to register as a sex offender. Although it would take longer than it should have, this would be the break police needed. Due to undisclosed problems at the lab where Carmen Estrada's sample was sent, her results were not matched to an offender. But the offender was in that database. The lab went through an audit and it was shut down in 2002. Through my research, I wasn't able to find the exact problems with this lab that led to the audit, but some of the samples they had were then sent to another lab for retesting. Carmen's samples were in this group. In 2003, police got the news they had been waiting for over a decade. they had a match. The tissue from under her nails was from a registered sex offender, a Houston man, a 41-year-old named Anthony Allen Shore. Police soon learned that Shore had worked as a telephone repairman, having a company van to go from job to job in. He had also worked as a tow truck driver. Both of these jobs allowed him to roam freely around the city without any real accountability. This gave him the perfect opportunity to hunt for victims. He was also in a rock band who played local venues in the evenings. Police issued a warrant and immediately went to his home. He was arrested with little resistance and taken to the station. The arrest of a suspect in the Dairy Queen murder was big news. News the city had been waiting over a decade for. When one local station heard the name and address of the suspect, they couldn't believe it. Their news crew had been at Anthony Shore's home just a couple hours before his arrest. Now, registered sex offenders are not allowed to decorate for Halloween or hand out treats or candy. This would encourage children to come to an offender's home. So the news station had randomly selected 20 sex offenders and gone to their homes to make sure they were in compliance for Halloween. After being processed, Anthony Allen Shore was taken in for questioning. He denied knowing anything they were talking about when they arrested him. 2 detectives questioned Shore for hours. He continued to deny any involvement. They told him they knew he had killed Maria del Carmen Estrada. They showed him pictures of the victim, pictures of her body. He still denied it. They asked about Diana Rebular and Dana Sanchez. He continued to deny any involvement. After 11 hours of questioning, one of the officers took Shore out to give him a break. They gave him time to go to the bathroom and eat and get a drink. When they went back in to resume questioning, Anthony Shore seemed different. He told the officer he didn't want to talk to him anymore, to send John in. John was Sergeant John Swaim. For reasons that would become apparent, Shore wanted John to be the one he talked to. He didn't know what to expect or why Shore wanted to talk to just him. In an astonishing twist, Anthony Shore said, "I'll give you those 3 and a couple bonus ones. Remember Lori Tremblay?" Sergeant Swaim was in shock. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been the lead investigating officer when 15-year-old Lori Tremblay was found strangled to death in 1986. Always looking to manipulate, Anthony Shore knew Swaim was the lead investigator. He wanted to shock him and delight in his response. Laura Tremblay had been raped and dumped behind a restaurant in Houston. The strangulation had been different from the others. She was strangled, but a tourniquet hadn't been used. Sergeant Swaim would soon learn why. Shore then began to tell John about each one of the murders and 2 more cases they hadn't linked to him yet. He started with the murder of Lori Tremblay. Now, this is from his confession. I've listened to the tapes, and I will say this is from his perspective. I watched a documentary where a psychologist pointed out that this is his way of maintaining control, his way of still controlling his victims by giving the story on his terms. Well, we don't have the victims here to get their side of the story. In 4 of these cases, the one surviving victim's account did match what Shore confessed to. His confession is very matter of fact. He recounts the murders with the same level of emotion as if he was talking about what he had for lunch. He shows no remorse for his crimes or his victims, and the only concerns he has are for himself. He worried about getting caught and costing him his job and or his marriage. He worried about causing himself discomfort or injury. So Anthony Shore started with the September 26, 1986 murder of Lori Tremblay. At the time, Shore was 24 and Lori was just 14. He claims he met her before the day that he killed her. He said she'd approached him while he was sitting at a stoplight and she asked him for a cigarette. From there, he claims they struck up a friendship. He said he would see her walking and offer her rides, which she would accept. He said the two became more than friends and that they would sometimes kiss. He said on the day he killed her, it had started out like normal. It was raining and he offered her a ride. They were in his van and they started to kiss. He said he wanted more and she said no. He reached around and unhooked her bra. According to Shore, at this point, she freaked out. She started yelling and fighting him. He claims he panicked. He was in his work vehicle and there was no way to explain himself. He said he was also worried that she would tell and he would get into trouble. He said he wanted to make sure she would never, ever tell anybody. So he struck her in the back of the head, and then he pulled her into the back of his van, where he raped her. He wrapped a cotton cord around her neck and tightened it. He said it kept breaking. This made it harder to kill her and caused the process to take longer than he expected. It required more physical force than he thought it would. There was a knuckle imprint left on the back of Lori's neck and 2 impression lines from the rope. He explained that during her murder, he cut his finger and hurt himself. That was when he knew he would need to alter his method to avoid hurting himself again. So he figured out an easier way. He then went on to tell John about 20-year-old Maria del Carmen Estrada. He seemed to be particularly fond of her. He said when he saw her, she was beautiful. He said he would see her walking while he was on his way to work. He fantasized about her. He offered her rides on multiple occasions, and she always turned him down. He said she told him her name was Carmen and that she didn't speak much English. He said he started to learn Spanish to be able to converse with her. Eventually, she accepted his rides, and they would talk. He said he flirted with her, and she seemed to like him back. On the morning of April 16th, 1992, it was raining. He picked her up while she was walking to work. He said he pulled in behind the Dairy Queen, thinking that they were going to have sex. He claims she told him, "No, not here, not like this." He made more sexual advances, and she turned him down. He didn't like to be rejected. He then became more physically aggressive with her. She fought back. She fought hard. He said, "I was going to have her regardless." She wasn't going to reject him. He was worried she would tell on him, so he pulled her into the back of his van and put a rope around her throat. He grabbed a pair of her scissors and cut through her clothes. He used the scissors as he attempted to rape her. He had put a cut piece of bamboo in the rope and used it to help tighten the rope around her neck. He continued to strangle her until he knew she was dead. He said he then opened the back doors of his van and pushed her partially clothed body out, leaving her behind the restaurant in the drive-through lane. He said he left there very quickly. He was worried someone would see him or his van and he would be caught. Shore told Sergeant Swaim that he had an evil inside and that he couldn't control it. He said he had crazy thoughts in his head, fantasies. He said he needed to prove to himself that he could control it. That would lead to his next victim, the only one who survived his attack. A year and a half later, he had become obsessed with another 14-year-old girl. He had seen her walking from school while he was driving his work van, and he began to stalk her. He watched her and played his sick fantasies through his mind again and again. After following her for a while, he knew her schedule for school and for sports. He also knew that her parents weren't home after school. On October 19th, 1993, he went into her house through the unlocked front door. He waited for her to come home. Disguised with a bandana over his face and sunglasses, he also wore surgical gloves and baggy clothes. When the girl entered her home, he grabbed her. He bound her hands with electrical cord and wrapped duct tape around her head. He took her into the bedroom where he removed her pants and cut off her panties. He then violently raped her as she cried and screamed. He started choking her, but she was able to break free from his grasp. He then decided to flee the house. He turned back to the hysterical girl, threatening that he would return and kill her and her family if she called the police. He also told her what school she went to and what activities she was involved in to make sure she knew he was serious. The police were called and the girl was taken to the hospital. During her examination, it was discovered that she had vaginal and anal tears. They also recovered a semen sample. Semen that would later be matched to Anthony Shore. Shore said that he had watched and fantasized about this girl. He felt he needed to prove something to himself. He believed that if he could just rape her and not kill her, it was proof that he was, quote, beating the evilness by controlling and possessing her without taking her life. Another example of his sociopathy. Of course, he wasn't able to maintain this control, and he would go on to kill again. On August 7th, 1994, Anthony Shore was driving in his work van when he saw little 9-year-old Diana Rebelar. Her mother had sent her to get sugar from the store. He said he pulled into a parking lot and he began talking to her. He looked around and didn't see anybody, so he grabbed the little girl, threw her in the back of his van, and duct taped her hands and feet. He drove to behind a building where he brutally beat and raped this poor little girl. He then strangled her using a rope and a piece of bamboo. The viciousness of her attack stayed with the police who found her. When I watched the interviews with the police years later, you could still see the pain in their faces when she was brought up. During his confession, Shore said about her attack, quote, "That was the sickest. I don't understand. Too young, not developed. That was an opportunity," end quote. His flippant comments about brutalizing and murdering a 9-year-old child gives clarity to his lack of feeling for any other living being. He truly was an evil monster. On July 6th, 1995, Anthony Shore was, once again, driving around in his work truck. He saw 16-year-old Dana Sanchez at a payphone. He said she appeared to be angry. He pulled up and offered her a ride. She accepted and they drove away. He started to make passes at her, which she refused. She told him she had a boyfriend. Then he started to touch her. She was pushing him away when he said he worried yet again that she would tell on him. He pulled her into the back of his van, where he said she bit him hard on the chest, hard enough to draw blood. He then restrained her and removed her clothes. He claimed he did not rape her, but he did strangle her to death using a rope and a toothbrush. It was a week later when he would call into the news station and announce there was a serial killer on the loose. During his confession, they asked why he made that call. He said he thought deep down he wanted to get caught so he would be stopped. I don't buy that. I think he wanted the attention. He admitted he would watch the news and read the papers, following information about his crimes. That's how he knew who John Swaim was. One detective said, quote, "Shore always thought he was the smartest person in the room. I think he liked to terrorize and shock people." I honestly think he took pleasure out of their responses. Why else would he have watched the woman from the news station as she answered the tip line? He wanted to see her physical reaction when he revealed that he could see her. He wanted to see her scared. The following year, while repairing a telephone line in a house, Anthony Shore noticed a picture on the wall of the homeowner's daughter. Her name was Amy. She was 17 and still in high school. He soon became obsessed with this teenager. He started following her and fantasizing about her. After she turned 18, they started dating. They were both musicians and shared a love of music. Although Tony Shore was 14 years older than she was, that didn't stop him from proposing to her. They got married in 1997. Now, after his first divorce, he had been given custody of his two daughters. The girls had lived with him and his fiancée. But when they got married, Tony felt that he needed a fresh start with just him and Amy. He sent his daughters, who were 11 and 13 at the time, to live with his mother in California. Once out of their father's grasp, the girls told their aunt and grandma the hell that they had been living. Their father was cruel and controlling. They also told them that their dad had been drugging and sexually abusing them for years. This was what would lead to his arrest. Their aunt and grandma knew that he had always had issues. He had exhibited disturbing behavior since he was very young. The family had always known something was wrong with him. When he was around 4 or 5, the neighbor's cat had come to the Shore house. Tony wanted the cat to stay, but the cat wanted to leave. He pulled and fought with the cat to try and keep it at his house, but it kept trying to leave. So he stabbed the cat, killing it. He had to make it stay. His strange behaviors weren't always violent. His sister said he was always very neat and tidy. Everything had to be perfectly placed. They said he even had to explain to them the proper way to eat a sandwich, that you needed to take neat, uniform bites, the teeth marks making a straight line as you ate the sandwich row by row. He was also musically gifted. His family described him as a musical prodigy who could pick up an instrument and instantly knew how to play it. He didn't, however, have the same physical gifts. He was small, he wasn't athletic. The kids at school picked on him and he was bullied. His father would get angry with him when he would come home beaten up by other kids. Now, the tormented often go on to torment others, and Tony was no different. He then started to become abusive to his sisters. When he was 10 years old, he attempted to stab his sister in the head with a screwdriver. Although this was documented, it doesn't seem this was taken as seriously as it should have been. He learned early on how to manipulate people to get what he wanted, his sisters being his first victims. He would use his sister to lure girls out of their homes. He would make her go to their doors, ring the bell or knock, and then ask their parents if they could come outside. Once the girl was outside of her home, he would send his sister away. At that point, he would touch and grope the girl that had been lured outside. This became a regular practice until they rang the doorbell of a teacher who knew him. The teacher, familiar with him and his behaviors, didn't let her daughter come out. His sister said that seemed to scare him. She never helped him lure girls out of their homes again. Now, even with his history, he somehow had managed to get away with all the terrible things he had done. But that was about to change. When Anthony was arrested for the sexual abuse of his daughters, he convinced his young wife that it was a mistake and that he hadn't done anything wrong. She believed him. She said she sold all of their musical instruments to pay for his defense. He had once told her he was going to make her famous. She said she thought it would be through their music, not because he was a monster. 2 years into their marriage, Amy said she awoke to him trying to choke her. Terrified, she fled their house. She filed for divorce 2 days later. His arrest and the revelations of the things he had done over the years brought more people forward with their own stories about interactions with him. There were other women who had missing pieces of memories when they had been in Anthony Shore's presence. His first wife, his second wife, and other friends and girlfriends would later say they believed that he had also drugged and raped them. Now, I wholeheartedly believe he had many more victims. Despite his taped confession, Anthony Shore pled not guilty. The case was going to trial. Although they had his confessions to 4 murders and an aggravated rape of a 14-year-old, they decided to only charge him with Carmen Estrada's murder. They had the best DNA evidence tying him to her case and felt that case had the best chance of securing a capital murder conviction. In October of 2004, he was found guilty of the murder of Maria del Carmen Estrada. During the sentencing phase, the only surviving victim testified about how he had raped her when she was 14. The woman recounted her terror and the pain she went through. She told them about how his attack had changed her and her family's life forever. The jury took less than an hour to deliberate and reach a decision on his punishment. They sentenced him to death, the punishment he had asked for. Anthony Shore remained on death row for 14 years. Ever the manipulator, when his first execution date was set, he started to confess to more crimes. One more way of trying to maintain control. When another date was set, he confessed to 60 more rapes. He was given a 90-day stay of execution for the claims to be investigated. There were other crimes that he could possibly have committed. One of his claims was that he had been the East Area rapist in San Francisco. Now, it would later be discovered through DNA that it had been another serial killer and rapist, Joseph D'Angelo, who was responsible for those crimes. Anthony Shore's sisters said there was always a rapist in the areas where they lived. She believes her brother was to blame for some of those. Law enforcement also believes that he committed more crimes than they have linked him to. After multiple attempts at trying to get out of his sentence, Anthony Allen Shore was put to death by lethal injection on January 18th, 2018 in Huntsville, Texas. He was the first inmate executed that year. Now, I had mixed emotions on how much of my personal connection I wanted to share about this case. During the time I worked at that Dairy Queen, I was stalked by a creepy guy. A guy who kept offering me rides. It wasn't Anthony Shore. It was just another creep. Houston had just passed a stalking law. My coworkers knew about the guy who had been following me, and he had been hanging out at the restaurant. One night, my boss called the police after a very scary interaction at my job. We had his license plate number, which allowed police to locate him right away. They told him to stay away from me and to stay away from the Dairy Queen. I moved shortly after this. I didn't know the murder of Maria del Carmen Estrada had been solved. One morning, recently, while getting ready for a meeting, I heard the case on another podcast. For years, I believed the guy who had stalked me had been the one who killed her. I would have bet on it. The realization that there were at least 2 predators on the same block where I lived and worked was scarier than thinking he was responsible for both. While researching this case, I had to wonder, did I ever interact with Anthony Shore while I was working? Was he the guy that brought up the murder at the counter? Did he ever come through my drive-thru and I handed him his order with a smile? I think about that parking lot that I walked across every day. While I don't obsess over the what ifs, I do occasionally allow my mind to wander. I don't remember what it was like to be that carefree teenager. Most of us never think about the people we pass by on a daily basis. The people we see at the stores or the repair people who come to fix things in our home. I do. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Crime Queen. Please like, follow, rate, review, and subscribe. If you have a story you would like me to cover or a story you would like me to share, please email me at thecrimequeen@gmail.com. Until next time, my crime kingdom, wear your crown, carry a sword.